Hello everyone and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. You may have noticed that I still released all of my episodes on Friday this week. I know I said that I was going to start releasing them on different days, and I will, but I thought I'd give it a little bit of time before I started doing that because I know I did just start releasing them in 3 parts instead of just 2. I'm thinking about starting that in 2 weeks where I release them on 3 days instead of in just 1 day. So not this next Friday, but the Friday after that. That's when I'm going to start doing it. And the days I'm thinking are Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Those seem fitting to me, and if you have any feedback, let me know in the comments if you're listening to this on YouTube. My DM advice episodes are going to be on Fridays and Saturdays when I start that, unless like this week in which I only have 1 DM advice episode, and that's because this episode is a short one, so I thought there was really no point in releasing it in 2 parts. And Sundays will be my stories. And I also want to thank you for choosing to listen to this episode today. Really thank you for showing interest in this show at all. I really appreciate that. But as promised, today we're talking about how to make your combat difficult. So let's learn something. If you're anything like me, making combat in the very beginning when you first start DMing can be kind of tough. In my first couple of campaigns, it seemed like my players just powered through all my combat without any real problems, and that can be kind of taxing or even boring for you and for your players. Obviously, there are a lot of tables where combat isn't the main focus. There are a lot of games that focus on other things than just combat, so what I'm going to say in this episode won't apply to everyone, and if that's you, that's fine, but don't leave just yet. Making difficult and challenging combat can be a great way to immerse your players, to give them the satisfaction of a hard-earned win, and even to band them together as a team. I talk about all of this in my first episode on immersion, so check that out if you haven't yet. But for today, how can we do this? How can we make our combat just a little bit more challenging? Well, I have 4 tips that I want to share today. I want to start with a really easy and simple one, and then move on to one that I think is really important and really encompasses all the others. So without further ado, let's start with the first one, and that is modify your monsters. This one's really important to me, and here's why. I always hear people complaining about how this or that system isn't balanced very well for combat or whatever, and I have to be honest, I've never really understood this. The power of this game is to create what's in your imagination, so it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to change the enemies you're going to have your players fighting to make them either more or less powerful. Now, I know what you're thinking. How can you expect me to do that? Isn't that really hard? Well, yeah, sure. It certainly isn't the easiest thing in the world to do, but it's like anything else with this game, and DMing and GMing in general. It takes time, and it comes with practice. So the best thing you can do for yourself is just jump in, try it out, see how it works, and learn from your mistakes. And the best part is, in game, if you make your enemies a little bit too powerful, you can always have some other part of the game bail your players out, or even just change the enemy mid-combat. Obviously, be careful with this, be cautious doing it because you don't want to do it too much, or else you might run the risk of eliminating all the risks and all the stakes you're trying to create by making the combat harder. But either way, modifying and making your own enemies is definitely a skill that's worth learning. I might actually do an episode where I create an example monster just to walk you all through how I do it. If you want me to do that, let me know. But for now, my process usually involves me either increasing or decreasing stats, building off of what the creature already is good at, and maybe even giving it a level or 2 in some class. Also, I want to note that when you're doing this, make sure that whatever you add or take away makes sense in the context. For example, I've talked about the flying goatman on the show before in my first episode on immersion. Again, check that out if you haven't yet. A while back, I made a group of goat people who were acrobats who dressed as pirates and called themselves the Flying Goatmen. It was absurd, and I loved them. I still love them. Either way, I gave them abilities that increased their athletics and acrobatic skills by upping their dex and strength a little bit. As a result, their AC, their armor class, also increased as it is based on dex. They're a little harder to hit, and their attack rolls also increased, so they're more likely to hit. Add in some extra damage and special attack, and you have yourself an upgraded enemy. For one more example, let's say you want your players to fight a chain devil, but they're a little bit of a higher level. Well, outside of the usual stat increases, what if they had a floating chain weapon? They gave them an extra attack or 2 outside of the usual 2, I think, that they usually get anyway. Additionally, you can also give them a few levels in a class. Again, I want to say, just make sure this fits the overall context of the campaign that this enemy is in. For example, let's say this chain devil serves a certain pit fiend or other kind of devil. Warlock could be really fun. They have the devil patron, and I think that'd be really cool actually. But really, you can make anything here work based on and depending on the context of your campaign, but that's it for that. Let's keep talking about enemies though, and we'll talk about something that you can do with your enemies that doesn't necessarily involve the game rules, and that's tactics. Remember, your players are probably, well, hopefully, going to try and play it smart, so your enemies should too. They probably shouldn't just try to crowd your players and throw themselves at them with reckless abandon. I mean, some will, but you need to plan that in advance. Maybe you have a group of goblins with traps in a forest, or a cunning wizard that simply blinks all over the battlefield, weakening the players little by little and letting their minions do the rest. I just ran a combat like that a little while back, and it went really well. I might actually tell that story in a future episode. Long story short, have the monsters play strategically. You may think this sounds overpowered, but here's the thing. It will probably also encourage creativity in your players as well, and when that happens, they might notice when your monsters make a strategic mistake or make a tactical error and take their opening, and they'll take their shot to really attack them. You see, this goes both ways. You can play your villains tactically, but also have them make little errors. That's another tool that I love to use. And before I move on to my next point, I want to run through a quick example with a monster that I love and is truly one of my favorites, but I haven't gotten the chance to run it in a while, and that is the Displacer Beast. If you don't know, the Displacer Beast is a large panther-like creature with 6 legs and 2 tentacles coming off of its back. It casts illusions around itself to make its actual location a little difficult to pin down. The book even says they hunt in small packs and like to ambush, and they hunt for sport. I think that's enough to work with, so let's see what we can do. So what can you do? Well, I'll probably have them stalk the party for a few days, hunting them down because they want a challenge. After all, they do hunt for sport. I actually think that would be a cool subversion of the whole hunting trope. Somebody listening to this, please use that and let me know how it goes. Please steal that idea from me. I think that'd be really cool. Anyway, they're smart, so I'd have them learn what the party is up to, making checks to see, all the while having them make stealth checks to make sure the party can't see them. Once they know what the party's up to, they might use that to lure them in and then ambush them. So let's say your party is looking for someone. The Displacer Beast pack hunting them, which by the way, the amount depends on the party's size and level, may learn about this, and then find some random person, take them out, and use that to lure them in as bait, making the party think that is who they're looking for. Maybe the party has to go through a narrow pass. The pack might use this to corner them, or maybe the party is hurt. The beasts would wait and then seize their moment right then. They'll also try to wait and pick the perfect place to strike, which brings me to my next point. Use the environment. I'll try to keep this in kind of brief, but all in all, your monsters don't have to be the only things fighting your players, nor should they be. They could be in a forest full of poisonous plants, or on a boat in the middle of a storm. In both of these cases, the location is doing things that might even get a turn. This can even balance the actions a little bit, so your players just aren't over there doing a ton of stuff, while the enemies just get 1 or 2 turns per round. This could even be part of a monster's lair. Maybe they're fighting a red dragon who lives in a volcano, and they have to dodge lava every now and then. Maybe there are traps scattered around, but the environment doesn't necessarily have to be doing anything to be dangerous. It really just can simply be a dangerous place, like a peak at the top of a mountain where your players have to make sure they don't fall off to their deaths, or a pit of quicksand where your players have to constantly be trying to scramble out during the fight. You can even sneak in things like loose pipes in a sewer, precarious platforms in some kind of factory, branches if you're in a forest, all things that your players and your monsters could use against one another if they feel so inclined. Also, be sure to be ready for when your players use things and do things in the environment that you're not ready for. But again, this is definitely something worth trying out, trying to incorporate into your repertoire of things as a DM that you can do, and getting good at. And lastly, whatever the environment is doesn't even necessarily have to be combat related. Not all combat happens in an arena. Not all combat happens in a ring. Plan the environment as if it is just the environment, and think of it as a combat related environment afterwards. And again, as I'd like to say, bonus points if it's related to the overall story. But that's it for using the environment for right now. For now, I'm going to take some time and talk a little bit about my next point, which I'm going to spend the most time on probably, and it is give your players other goals and challenges throughout the combat as well. As I already said, this is really the most important thing that I think you can do to make your combat more difficult and more engaging and just better in general, I think. And it's really easy to do. Here are some examples. One really simple way to do this is by giving your enemies goals. Maybe they're not just trying to kill the players, but they also want to kidnap one or steal something, and you can kind of start to see how this immediately changes the combat. This not only does you a lot of favors for combat, I'll get back to that in a second, but for right now, it also does you a lot of really cool favors in terms of the overall story. It can help you add things to the story, generate generate ideas for the story, build off of the story. It can even help you make the combat more related to the story, as well as just being more engaging in general. And I think it does this by setting boundaries and limitations for you. I find that if I really want to force creativity and if I really want to create something and make something new, giving myself these kinds of boundaries can really help out. So I'll say, I want this combat to be related to this part of the story, and I'll immediately start coming up with ideas, and I can branch out like I always say I like to do. But in terms of combat more specifically, this makes your players kind of split their attention between just fighting and then trying to stop the enemies from achieving whatever goal they're trying to do. And you can get really creative with the goal too, but making your players split their attention like this automatically makes the combat a little bit more difficult because they can no longer just simply concentrate their attacks like they're probably used to doing typically. It's almost like you're taking away actions from them without actually taking away actions. And as a bonus, it's also just more fun in my opinion. It's a fun way of taking away actions. It makes the combat no longer just a brutal slugfest back and forth that's just boring. Instead, it's a tactical chess match. This is where tactics really come in, funny enough. If your monsters have goals and are acting tactically, then your players have to think a little on their feet too. But again, like I said earlier, you don't have to go overboard. You can have your enemies make some kind of tactical mistake, give your players a little bit of an upper hand, and make sure they win the combat in the end. It'll still feel well earned and hard fought. But in addition to just goals related to the combat, moral dilemmas can be kind of fun here too. Maybe they see a friend of theirs in danger or have to choose between two goals. You can even have something else here go on as well, like a complex social interaction amid the conflict. That can be really fun if done properly. And lastly, it's not always about what your enemies are doing in combat, but also it's about what they're hiding and whatever else they might be involved in outside of combat. If you make the location relevant to the overall story, chances are during combat, there might be little things nearby that can hint to your players and tip your players off to whatever your enemies might be doing at the time. Your players can then investigate that, figure something out, and then learn about the enemies to have the upper hand later on. This splits their attention as well. Instead of just fighting the enemies, now they're also looking around for something, and they're trying to uncover whatever's at the bottom of what's actually going on. Additionally, what else are your players doing? Maybe there's a quest goal nearby. Now your players need to complete whatever they're trying to do, whether it be rob a bank, save a prisoner, or whatever else, while fending off the bad guys during this combat. But that's it for this episode. Be sure to listen to my other episode this week, where I tell a story about a character that I more recently played, and join me next week, where I'll go back to talking about advice for keeping the game running smoothly again, and finish off the story of Luna that I started last week. Thanks so much for listening, and as always, until next time, let's learn something.